So today we will discuss consumer surplus. And I hope you are able to understand the concept of income consumption curve and price consumption curve. Okay. So this is the last topic which we are discussing in unit 1. From next class, we will start the second unit, and that is production and producer behavior. And I hope that you don't have any confusion regarding what we have covered and what we have to study. Okay, so today our discussion is about consumer surplus. So, as we were discussing yesterday, consumer surplus is a situation where where consumer is willing to pay a price and consumer actually pays a price, and these two price, if they are different, then there will be a consumer surplus situation. Now, this is very simple and very relevant to your daily consumer behavior, right? When we see you as a consumer, so you purchase lot many things. And when you purchase, for all purchases, you always have a price in your mind. For most of the things, even if you say, even if you don't have a price, at least you have a budget constraint, right? You have n number of wishes, but you can fulfill only few of your wishes because of your budget constraint. So, given the budget constraint, you always try to figure out that what is the maximum price which you can pay for anything, for any purchase which you are trying to make, whether it is books, whether it is clothes, whether it is food, whether it is rent, whether it is transport, whether it is entertainment, whether it is using the internet connection for attending classes, or whether it is choosing your section for various subjects, choosing the institution where you want to study. Every decision which a consumer takes, consumer has an idea or consumer has an expectation regarding the price and regarding the utility, right? Try to understand this fact that everyone, whenever they take a decision, they take a decision with some expectation. Now, how much that expectation is fulfilled, that decides that how consumer is able to utilize, maximize its utility. Okay, because what you say, satisfaction or utility is the objective of consumer. And what is satisfaction or what is utility? The extent to which your wish gets fulfilled or your need gets fulfilled, that gives you utility, that gives you satisfaction. Okay, so satisfaction is the capacity to fulfill the wish or need of an individual, which is in the commodity or the service or the good or the decision which you are talking about. So suppose that we draw a table, and this is again just we are taking an example. So units of x, you want to purchase certain units of x, and suppose this can be anything, but suppose you say this can be, say, shoes, just for example. Okay, you are trying to purchase shoes. So when you are trying to purchase shoes, willingness to pay. And the third information which we need for this is market price. In the market, there will be a price. Now, when we are talking about this, please remember that there are certain assumptions which are applicable, and that ceteris paribus is still working. Consumer surplus is the idea where ceteris paribus becomes very crucial. Without ceteris paribus, we cannot discuss about consumer surplus. Other things remaining constant is very essential here. Okay, now suppose that you are purchasing, say, 5 units of shoes. You are thinking that you can purchase 5 units of shoes. And when you are thinking about the first unit of shoes, then suppose your idea is 500. You can pay 500 for the first pair of shoes. When you are thinking about the second unit of shoes, then maybe your idea is, your willingness is rupees 450, because you understand that as you increase the consumption of the same good, as you consume more and more unit of the same good, marginal utility declines. And as the marginal utility declines, your willingness to pay also declines. So suppose you are willing to pay only rupees 450. With the third unit, suppose your willingness even decreases further and it comes down to 400. With the fourth unit, 350. Then with the fifth unit, suppose you are willing to pay only 200. So fifth pair of shoes, if it is available in 200 rupees, then only you will purchase. Now we are talking about a market price. Now suppose the market price is 400. 400 for all units, because market price will always remain constant and market price is always given. So market price is fixed, it is constant. I told you that there are certain assumptions with which we are working here. Okay, so price remains constant and price is given. You cannot do anything in terms of price. You don't decide the price. Price is already given to you because price is decided by the seller. And remember one thing, that here we can also assume that we are not considering bargaining here. We are not thinking about how much you will bargain. It is only that what you can maximum pay. Willingness to pay is actually related to maximum price which you can pay. And market price is the actual price which you have to pay. Okay, now see this difference. And this will be your consumer surplus. 500 minus 400, so you have a surplus, and this is notional only, not in real sense, but you were thinking 500 and you got it at 400, so what you are saving is 100. then you are saving 50, then you are not saving anything, and then you are actually in a negative situation where you are paying 50 rupees more, and here you are paying 200 rupees more. Okay, so now what do we do? It's very simple. Here you take units of X, and here you take price. So the market price is 400. Okay, suppose we start like this: 200, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600. So market price is 400. Now market price is this. But initially, when you were thinking of the first unit, you were willing to pay the price 500. Okay, so your demand curve starts from here. When you are thinking of, say, the first unit, and first unit, suppose we take here. So that is a point which you are getting. Then for the second unit, you are thinking of 350 or 450. So suppose the point is here. For the third unit, you actually are thinking of 400 and you are paying 400. So suppose we join these dots and we get a line like this. So this is your usual demand curve. Demand curve for X. Now, how do you identify the consumer surplus? This area. Okay, this whole triangle above the market price. This is your consumer surplus. Okay, this area is consumer surplus. Okay, now let us draw the diagram again and try to understand it in a better way. Unit of X, unit of X good, okay, and price of X. So suppose 400 was the market price. So at 400, the price is constant and you can purchase as many units you can or you want to. Okay, but when you are thinking of purchasing this X, suppose it starts from here, right? If you do not have any unit of X, so you have a very high utility for this. You don't have, suppose you are talking about shoes and you don't have any shoes with you. You don't have any slippers and you don't have any shoes, and that is essential for you. So you will have a higher utility for this and you will be willing to pay as much as price you can think of, being a rational consumer. So that will decide the limit, maximum limit in which you are willing to pay. Now, as you start purchasing, you will see that given the law of diminishing marginal utility, you will be willing to pay less and less price to get more and more units of X. So the point where actual price and willingness price becomes equal to each other, that is a point where actually consumer behavior takes place. Okay, so this is the equilibrium point where actually you are purchasing and you are purchasing at 400, and suppose you are purchasing the third unit at 400. Okay, 1, 2 and 3. So this whole area will be termed as consumer surplus. Okay, so how you define the consumer surplus? The difference between the willingness to pay and the price actually paid is the consumer surplus. And how do you decide the willingness to pay? Willingness to pay depends on the utility. Now, consumer does not want to leave the consumption of this commodity, right? X good which you are talking about, this has a larger utility for this consumer. So instead of not consuming this commodity, he is willing to pay a price. And up to the point where the willingness price is greater than the actual market price, he will have a consumer surplus. If he purchases at this point, actually he does not have any consumer surplus. But suppose he purchases only 2 units, then definitely up to 2 units, he will have consumer surplus. Okay, so if you want to define this again, like how do you define the consumer surplus? So consumer surplus is simply the difference between the price which the consumer is willing to pay and the price which is actually paid by the consumer. And why there is a difference? You say that, and suppose we name it. So how do we name it? We say L T E. So this triangle So I hope this is clear because it is very simple to understand that consumer does not want to leave the consumption of this commodity. So instead of being without consuming this commodity, consumer is willing to pay a price. And if the willingness price is different from the actual price, then there is a possibility of consumer surplus. Okay. Now suppose that if the price increases to 420 or 430. So if the price increases, the consumer surplus will come down. You can see that if the price increases, the triangle will become small. Okay. And if the price decreases, then the consumer surplus will increase. Because consumer surplus is what? Consumer surplus is the area above the actual market price. So if the actual market price is passing from this region, then your consumer surplus triangle will increase. Right? So this is the Marshallian approach. Marshallian approach of consumer surplus define consumer surplus as an area above the actual price paid. So the area between the point from where demand curve starts and the actual price becomes the region of consumer surplus. Okay. From here, you can see that at L point, demand curve is starting. The originating point of demand curve is L. That means if consumer does not have anything, it will perceive that the utility of this good is very high. So he is willing to pay a very high price. But actually, when he starts purchasing, the law of demand starts operating, and consumer will be consuming more only when the price decreases. But in the market, price actually does not decreases with every unit of purchase, because price is generally given and it remains constant. Okay, so Marshall says that consumer surplus is the difference between willingness to pay and actual price paid by the consumer. Now, because this is the Marshall's approach, so all the assumptions of Marshall theory, law of demand, is applicable here. What are the assumptions? They are also important. Assumptions in your consumer surplus theory. Assumptions in consumer surplus theory. The first thing which maybe you can identify, utility is measurable. That is how you are able to measure the utility in terms of price. That utility is measured as willingness to pay. Okay. The second idea or the second assumption which is there is marginal utility of money remains constant. Okay. Third is market price is given. Market price is given and constant. That means there is no scope for bargaining, or in other words, actually we can say that there is perfect competition in the market. Okay, which we will understand in the coming classes. When we'll talk about markets, we'll talk about perfect competition. But remember one thing here, that perfect competition is a market where price is already given. No one decides the price. No one decides the price means buyers and sellers do not control the price. Buyers and sellers cannot affect price. Individually. So this was the Marshall's approach. But now you will have again criticism, right? You must be thinking that when we cannot measure the utility, how we can measure the consumer surplus like this? So Hicks give you the alternative measure of consumer surplus. So Hicks approach of consumer surplus. Now here please pay attention, okay? Otherwise you will not be able to understand this. Now what is the Hicks approach of consumer surplus? For Hicks, utility is ordinal. Okay, utility can always be ranked only, and therefore utility is shown by an indifference curve. Okay, so we will use the indifference curve technique to explain consumer surplus. Indifference curve, IC is every time indifference curve. IC technique, indifference curve technique, to find out consumer surplus. Okay, now see. Here you are taking X good, and on the Y axis you are taking money income. Okay, and therefore we are writing M here. So on one side you have money income, on the other side you have X commodity. You are not talking about price now, but you are talking about money income. Okay, given the money income, you remember what was the condition of equilibrium in the indifference curve? The indifference curve is tangent on the budget line. In other words, slope of indifference curve is equal to slope of price line or your budget line. So when you say budget line, you remember that how we have written that. M is equal to Px Qx plus Py Qy. That's how we were writing. Okay. Either you can write M or you can write Y also. Y will be income and M actually indicates the money income. Money income means 100 rupees you have, 200 rupees you have. So now, given the money income, suppose the indifference curve is looking like this. I see. And it starts from this point. Are you able to see this point? This is, say, small m. Now, why it is starting from here? It is starting from here because now this indicates that consumer has OM amount of income. OM is the income of consumer. So if consumer does not consumes anything, he will be left with OM income. But if he consumes, then he has to pay out of his income. So suppose now the consumer is not at M point, but the consumer is at L point. So now at L point, what happens? If you are able to understand this. X is X1 and consumer is paying some income. Okay. Now, how do we find out that how much income is being spent on this X1? That is important for us to understand. So you start from up and then you take this point. Excuse me. So now what happens? This is, suppose you call this P. So MP is the income which is paid to consume X1. Now consumer is left with OP. Earlier the income of the consumer was OM, but if he consumes OX1, then the leftover income will be OP. So leftover income will be counted from below and the income spent on the commodity will be counted from above. Okay. So when you are spending, you are actually moving from up to down. And the more you consume, the more income you will be spending on this commodity and less you will be left with. You can increase the X units and then you can understand. Okay. So this is a situation where consumer is just thinking that how much he can purchase. Now there will be a price in the market. And suppose the consumer wants to consume, say, X2 quantity. So if he wants to consume X2 quantity, he is willing to forego MP star of the income. Okay. So he will be left with OP. Okay. MP star he will pay. He will spend on X2, OX2, and he will be left with OP star. Now suppose he goes to the market. Now when he goes to the market, he observes that there is a budget line given as MN. Now MN is the budget line given the market price. Now you understand that market price will decide the maximum quantity which the consumer can consume. So suppose if you talk about M point is a situation which is explaining that consumer is not consuming anything but he has OM income. Okay, so you start your day and you are not spending anything, so you have MOM income with you. Now, as the day progresses, you consume, you spend on various things, and that's how your income reduces. So, the reduction in income because of your consumption is shown from up to down. Now, with this budget line, actually, you are still trying to consume OX2. You want to consume OX2 only. So now try to find out this OX2 point on this given budget line. So what do? You extend this OX2 point up to the budget line and you get a point here. Now it means that actually your indifference curve is passing through this point. Okay, and suppose we call this IC0 and we call this IC1. So IC0 is that indifference curve which is indicating your willingness or which is indicating your planning, and IC1 is the indifference curve which actually exists and you are in equilibrium at E point. Okay, now at E point, how much you are paying for this OX? You are paying OP. Okay. So now what happens? MP is the income which you have to forego. MP is the income which the consumer has to forego to consume OX2. That means this area is your consumer surplus. Because earlier when you were not aware about the budget line, when you were not aware about the price of the commodity, you were willing to pay MP star for OX2. But when you come to know about the price, you are actually paying only MP. So the difference between what you are willing to pay and and what you actually pay tells you the consumer surplus. So let me draw this again so that you are able to see it properly. Here we are taking M, that is money income. And here you are talking about X units. Okay, or X goods, X good. Now this is suppose an indifference curve. You can also call it an imaginary indifference curve, which is trying to explain the willingness of the consumer. So if you don't consume anything, you will have OM income. And if you consume something, then you have to pay your income from up to down. Now suppose you want to consume OX2. Now, in order to consume OX2, you are willing to pay MP star. So, MP star is the income spent on OX2 by the consumer according to its willingness. Okay. Now you draw a budget line. And the budget line will start from M point only, because this is one extreme which you know already. And this point will be, this N point will be another extreme. That suppose if you consume n unit of X, then you will be left with zero income, because you have spent your whole income on consuming X. So N is the maximum amount of X which you can purchase. N point indicates the maximum amount of X which the consumer can purchase, and M indicates the maximum income which consumer can have. Now consumer wants to consume X2, so this X2 line will be extended from IC0 to the budget line, and there will be another indifference curve tangent on this point, that will be IC1. So you have E point. Okay. Now at E point, the income which the consumer has to spend will be P. So MP is the actual income spent. So consumer surplus is equal to willingness minus actual. So this will be equal to, willingness was what? MP, and actual what you are, MP star, and what you are paying actually is MP. So you are left with what? P star. So PP star is the per unit consumer surplus. Okay. And if you want to find out the total consumer surplus, then per unit consumer surplus, which is PP star multiplied by OX2, will give you the total consumer surplus. So PP star is per unit consumer surplus, and total consumer surplus is equal to, so let us call this L, P star P E L, according to this Hicksian approach. So this is Hicksian approach of consumer surplus, and the straight line demand curve will tell you the Marshall's approach of consumer surplus. Okay. Now consumer surplus, the concept of consumer surplus is important in order to understand the consumer behavior as well as elasticity. Now, there is a simple rule. The rule is, higher the elasticity of demand, lower is the consumer surplus. And vice versa, lower the elasticity of demand, higher will be the consumer surplus. Okay. And suppose the demand is elastic. Demand is elastic means what? With very small change, the demand changes to a larger extent. Then it is elastic demand. Okay. So suppose here you take X and here you take price of X. So here you take Q of X, here you take price of X, and suppose the demand curve is looking like this. And if the demand rises, so increase in demand will be shown as D2. Now see what is happening. And suppose this is the normal supply curve. Okay. So here, now try to link it here. So if the price was this, you are willing to pay this price and you are actually paying this price. P star is the actual price which you are paying. And L is the price which you are willing to pay, maximum. Okay. So this area will be your consumer surplus. But if you increase your demand, then see what is happening. Okay, so willingness is quite high and you are paying a higher price. So your consumer surplus changes, right? So the rule is that higher the elasticity of demand, lower is the consumer surplus. Now there is one more thing which I can tell you, or you can on your own think of it. You can try with different types of diagrams, different slopes of demand curve, and then you will be able to understand it in a better way. See what we are doing here. Try to see carefully. This is D of X. Okay. This is supply of X. So the point where these two curves cut each other or intersect each other, that is the equilibrium point, and that is the equilibrium price. Okay. Now see what is happening. You have two different triangles. If you can identify here. Okay. So this area is consumer surplus. This triangle, the above triangle. So suppose we call it PELE and then we call it T. And this area is producer surplus. So PELE is consumer surplus. And PETE is no. So how we are trying to understand this is that the difference between willingness to pay and the actual price paid by the consumer tells you the consumer surplus. And what is producer surplus? Producer surplus arises when the minimum price which the producer is expecting is different from the actual price which he gets. Now, here in this diagram, you can see that the minimum price which the producer is expecting is T. He will not sell if the price is lower than T. And as the price is rising, he is supplying more and more. Okay. So actually he is receiving PE, but minimum at least he should get T. So that's how till the point he is selling before E, you will find that he is having a surplus, or you can say that he is earning more than what he is expecting. He is getting more than what he is expecting. So always remember this, that whenever there is an area above the price, that will tell you the consumer surplus, and the area below the market price will tell you the producer surplus. Okay. Now, as supply decreases, now understand from here. Suppose the supply decreases. So there is a contraction in supply. Supply comes down. Now what happens? As the supply comes down, the price increases and the surplus decreases. So what the supplier is doing actually, because the demand is quite elastic, so supplier is trying to capture a large part of consumer surplus from the consumer by reducing the supply. Okay, that's how I was telling you that the simple rule is that higher is the elasticity of demand, lower will be the consumer surplus, because if the demand is very elastic, then the supplier can change the supply and affect the consumer surplus. But suppose the demand is inelastic, that means demand does not changes much with the price. Then the supplier will not be in a position to change the supply and affect the consumer surplus. So consumer surplus can be captured by the supplier only if the demand is elastic. If the demand is very inelastic, or if the demand is less elastic, then the price changes will not affect much. Okay. So in that way, we can understand this concept, and this is one of the important concept when you will talk about tax. See, if you think about tax, why government imposes a tax? So when government imposes a tax, actually government takes away the consumer surplus because the price goes up. And higher the elasticity of demand, larger will be the proportion of consumer surplus which the government can capture. Okay. And how does the elasticity gets decided? It gets decided by the amount paid by the consumer on a certain commodity. So if the consumer pays a higher share of income or expenditure, you can say elasticity is directly related to share of expenditure. Higher the share of expenditure, higher will be the elasticity. Lower the share of expenditure, lower will be the elasticity. So demand is inelastic when consumer spends a very small share of income or expenditure on that commodity. Now, this is applicable for both the situations, whether you are talking about dire necessities or whether you are talking about basic minimum goods. Okay, in both the situations, the consumer spends a very small proportion of the income, or the demand is very essential for the consumer. Okay, so in that case, changing the price much will not affect the consumption much. But in case of elastic demand, because the consumer is spending a substantial amount of income or expenditure on the commodity, therefore supplier as well as government can capture a larger amount of consumer surplus by changing the price or by affecting the price. Right? So we are stopping here and we'll meet in the next class and we'll start production. Okay, thank you.